Now, before we do this, let's go over the ground rules. Rule number 1, no touching of the hair or face. And that's it! Now let's do this!
The Dayne Young SEC Podcast.
We don't need to be the best team in the country, but let me tell you what, we must be the best team in the stadium. We don't have to be better than anybody else. We're better than every team in the stadium, and every Saturday we will win the national championship.
For HolyTurf.com.
Coming up next is the part of the program I hate the most because I always offend a lot of people here. I'm going to talk about college football.
It's Week 8, SEC football fans. I'm Dayne Young with your SEC podcast for HolyTurf.com. And if you want to get a hold of me, get your ideas, your questions, whatever it may be, onto the Dayne Young SEC podcast, you can contact me on Twitter at Dayne Young. That's DAYNEYOUNG. And as always, make sure you're checking out all the great content over at HolyTurf.com. Flint and all the contributors have done a really great job with the site, and it's been a pleasure to contribute to them myself. So this week, we're going to do things a little bit differently. And I know my first podcast a couple weeks ago, we had one of my friends on here is a guest who's an Alabama fan, and he was right in that instance talking about Bama and Arkansas. Bama did pull that game out in the end. This time, what I've decided to do, because football, sports, it's one of my biggest passions. Another one is music. And so what I've done is I have a song that I'm going to play that really signifies, I guess, the culture around the game that I'm talking about at that time. You'll kind of see how that works when I get there. Just to give you a preview of what is coming up in the podcast, we're talking every SEC football game this week. There's 6 of them. Florida does have the week off, so there will be very little Gator talk on this podcast as they prepare for the cocktail party that will be held Halloween weekend in Jacksonville against Georgia Bulldogs. Now, when you get into the first game I want to talk about, it's going to be Ole Miss versus Arkansas. And you're wondering, what song am I going to use for that one? And it's Surrender by Cheap Trick, because I think this is finally the game where Houston Nutt will have to surrender to his old team come the end of the fourth quarter, because for the past 2 years, Houston Nutt has beaten his former team in Arkansas. Ole Miss is really down this year, though. You remember the early season loss to Jacksonville State. But, you know, maybe this game will have a lot of storylines. You have Ryan Mallett coming back off of this concussion. He did practice this week, so Razorback fans can breathe a little bit easier. Although his backup last week did play rather well, and in my opinion, I thought that was really good to see if you're an Arkansas fan, knowing that if Mallett does bolt for the NFL, then you still have Tyler Wilson right there in the background. He threw 4 touchdowns last week, and Bobby Petrino had really great things to say about him. But that was last week's game. You talk about this week, Arkansas's 4-2, Ole Miss is 3-3, and this game is it's at Arkansas, and so that should bode well for the Razorbacks. They're 1-1 at home. They're 3-1 on the road. The stat that gets you for Arkansas is that they're 0-2 in their own division, and one of those losses obviously was to Alabama, and the other one was to Auburn last week in the 65-43 game. And I wasn't aware that they were playing a basketball game last week, but apparently they were, and I thought that the defense has to step up for Arkansas if they have any New Year's Day bowl game aspirations, in my opinion, because their schedule, it does lighten up. They have played their toughest in Auburn and Bama, but they still do have South Carolina. Mississippi State's a solid team, and obviously the end of the year contest with LSU. So I think this is a really good bounce-back game for Arkansas, not to mention, you know that they just want to beat Houston Nutt, their old coach. So I'm picking the Razorbacks in this game. I don't think it'll be that close, really. Ole Miss hasn't done much to impress me so far to this point in the season. I mean, you look, I already mentioned the loss to Jacksonville State to open this season. They beat Tulane. It wasn't convincing. They lost to Vandy, and Vanderbilt got torched in Athens against the Dogs last week. So, I mean, Ole Miss did put 10 points on Alabama, but I'm not impressed with the Rebels at this point, and I think that they're probably in a contest with Tennessee to see who's the worst team in the SEC at this point. And so we will move on to the next game. All right, the next game we're going to run through is South Carolina this week, and the song is Break Your Heart, because if you're a Carolina fan, you have to have your heart broken after, I mean, you were in the driver's seat. I said this in my article this week for Holy Turf. I said that they're in the driver's seat, but they can't see over the steering wheel. I mean, they have had the SEC East given to them so far this year, and they haven't taken it. They lost to Auburn late in that game, and then they lose to Kentucky last week, which was a terrible loss. The Wildcats came back in the second half to beat Carolina 38-21. The game was in Lexington, and Carolina will stay on the road this week as they play Vanderbilt and Vandy. To be honest, they're not even good. They're not good at all. Georgia, a pedestrian Georgia team, put 43 points up on Vandy, and Vandy didn't score anything. So Vandy is really demoralized at this point. They lost earlier in the season 40-21 against UConn. They really don't have that much going for them. I mean, I don't even really know what their offense is. I guess if you had to pick a guy, it would be Larry Smith, their quarterback, with his 5 touchdown passes on the year. But you also look, he's got 4 interceptions. He's not that great of a player. He's a good athlete, but his decision-making at this point doesn't impress me. Carolina, you got to hope that Lattimore is okay to keep going after his injury last week. And he's the playmaker. He's got 10 touchdowns on the season. They have as many running touchdowns as they do passing touchdowns. So you hope that if you're a Gamecock fan, if they don't break your heart again this week against Vandy, you're still in the driver's seat. You win out, then you will win the SEC East. It's that simple. But it's not a gimme game. I mean, Vanderbilt has talent. Georgia demoralized them last week, so we'll see if South Carolina can do the same thing. And so maybe the Gamecock fans will not have their heart completely broken for a second week in a row. And now we're going to shift over to a team that is saying, hey, now I'm here. That being Mississippi State. The Bulldogs of the Western Division in the SEC are really turning things around. Dan Mullen is probably a hero down in Mississippi at this point after beating Georgia at home earlier in the season and then beating Florida at the Swamp. Who would have ever thought that Mississippi State would have beaten both Georgia and Florida at the beginning of the year? Now, the Bulldogs do play out of conference this week as they host the UAB Blazers. And while this may seem like an easy game for Mississippi State, watch out, because these are the same Blazers that took Tennessee into overtime and was beating Tennessee for the entire game. I mean, Tennessee's not that good, but Mississippi State needs to watch out and avoid the letdown game. They do have a relatively tough schedule coming up. They have to play Bama and Arkansas in November, and don't forget about Kentucky next weekend. So UAB is kind of thrown in the middle of the schedule, but this would be pivotal for a really solid bowl game for Mississippi State, which is something that they're not used to. Mississippi State needs to win this game if they're trying to change the culture in Starkville. They've already got it started because they did get a ranking. They're ranked number 24th in the country. If they can keep this up, get a good bowl game, who knows what Dan Mullen can do at this point. I know Florida misses Dan Mullen, and I know Mississippi State is very, very glad to have him there. And you have to really give a lot of credit to their running back, Big Ballard. 11 touchdowns on the season. He ran for 98 yards against Florida on 20 carries. This guy's legit. He's only a junior, so he will be back next year. Or at least that's a safe assumption. He's not one of the big-name stars that would go early. And then we have one of the most bitter rivalries that you'll find in the SEC. You've got Alabama taking on Tennessee, and I think that this one will be a blowout. That's why the song is Don't Stop Till You Get Enough, because I think that Alabama can just pick the number, really, at this point. Tennessee's 0-3 in the SEC. My opinion, worst team in the conference. They were terrible at Georgia 2 weeks ago. They haven't been impressive all year. They did play with Florida a little bit, and they gave LSU quite the game, but they didn't know how many people they had on the field. So a lot of coaching problems, I think, with Derek Dooley's squad. And if they want to beat Alabama, they just have to play a lot better. You can't lose to Oregon as bad as they did, lose to Florida like they did, lose to LSU close, lose to Georgia as bad as you did, and still have a shot with that same mindset against Alabama. Alabama will completely take you out of the game, put it in their hands, a field position, run the clock type of game. Now, I don't think Bama's going to blow them out 55-0 or anything like that, but I think Alabama's going to have complete control of this game, and by the end of the first quarter, Tennessee might as well go home at that point. So it's a good thing it's at Tennessee, so they don't have far to go. I think that Alabama, this is a game that they need because you look at their schedule coming up, it doesn't get too much easier for the Crimson Tide. They have a lot of, the West is where the best teams are, and we all know that because the East is garbage at this point, and you can read my article on Holy Turf for the week, and you'll see that. They have LSU next week, Mississippi State the next week, and then they play Georgia State, which is, I'm in the state of Georgia right now. The fact that Georgia State in their first year of football gets to play Alabama later in the season, pure joke. I can't wait to watch that. And then at the end of the year, they obviously have Auburn. I really want to see Mark Ingram pick it up. He doesn't even have 500 yards to his name at this point in the season running the ball. He and Richardson almost have the same numbers. It's really scary. I think Alabama needs to really get more crisp as they prepare to go down to the Bayou to play at Death Valley at night against LSU next week. So I'm expecting a big win this week from the Crimson Tide. And this next one I'm going to talk about relatively briefly because I do want to give the most time to the most important game in the SEC this week. But the reason for this music, Bluegrass State, Bluegrass Song, Wes Amos doing banjos. Georgia going to Kentucky. Kentucky with a big win at home last week against South Carolina. So Georgia really needs to watch out in this game. Kentucky's solid. They're 4-3 overall. They are 1-3 in the SEC. The Dogs are looking good, though, after big wins against Tennessee and Vanderbilt. Finally good to get back on the winning track after that 4-game losing streak early in the season. Aaron Murray has been playing phenomenal for Georgia, and Hudson Mason even got in the game last week at quarterback. It's always good when your backup can get in for some playing time. And Georgia needs to make sure their running game stays on track. Rashawn Ely broke the 100-yard mark for the first time last week, and then Caleb King is serving the second of his 4-game suspension. No player has been arrested this week for Georgia, so that's a good sign. Kentucky does have a solid team, though a lot of people really like the athletes that they have on their side of the ball. You look at guys like Mike Hartline or Derek Locke. A lot of people think that Locke is one of the most underrated players. I think Hartline has 13 touchdowns in the air so far this year. Watch out for the Wildcats in this one. And if you don't know what the song is for the biggest matchup of the week, LSU and Auburn, you should be ashamed because there's only one choice. That's right, it's Eye of the Tiger. You've got the Bayou Bengals of LSU, and you've got the Battle Cry of the War Eagle from Auburn. Two undefeated teams, both in the top 6. Auburn's number 4, LSU's number 6. This is huge. This is the SEC game of the week. This is the one that if you're sitting in your living room, the atmosphere that you just see on the TV will get you jacked up, almost like you're a student for one of these schools. One of the biggest games that you'll find, not only in the SEC, but in the country this year. Both undefeated, as I said. LSU has been more lucky than good, but sometimes that's better. Auburn has been more good than lucky, sometimes that's better too. Auburn did have that close game against Mississippi State on Thursday night earlier in the season, but since then Cam Newton has come into his zone, and I think that, you look at the amount of points that Auburn put up last week on Arkansas, you have to pick the Tigers of Auburn to win this game, and I think LSU might struggle a little bit. We'll see. They have the athletes to play with Auburn for sure. The biggest thing to watch out is how will Jordan Jefferson play when it matters, because he has 7 interceptions and only 2 touchdowns through the air this season. Cam Newton's numbers, amazing. 12 touchdowns on the ground and 13 in the air, only 5 interceptions on the year. Freaking nature. That's all there is to it. And so that's the biggest game of the week. That's the one that you want to watch. So when you get to church on Sunday or to work on Monday, everyone will be talking about this game. It will be very, very exciting. And I do want to give credit for all the songs that I've played. Survivor, Eye of the Tiger is what you're currently listening to. We have Michael Jackson, Don't Stop Till You Get Enough. Queen, Now I'm Here. Cheap Trick with Surrender. AC Dixie with Dueling Banjos. And Tayo Cruz with Break Your Heart. In the last 30 seconds, I'll give you the game times for the weekend. All these are Eastern times, okay? So Georgia, Kentucky is at 7:30 Eastern. LSU, Auburn is at 3:30 Eastern. UAB, Mississippi State is at 7 o'clock Eastern. Ole Miss and Arkansas is at 12:30 Eastern. South Carolina and Vandy is at 7 p.m. Eastern. And Alabama, Tennessee is at 7 o'clock Eastern time zone. And this has been the Dayne Young SEC Podcast. Thank you for listening. As always, check out holyturf.com. Find me on Twitter. And we will see you next week.